Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. For this bonus episode, we're announcing our lineup for Season 9, SNL Vehicles. Oh, and not live, not from New York, it's not Saturday night! On regular episodes of Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, or as the late great Don Pardo would say, Thomas! And of course I have my guest host here, Brian!
Hello. I do not have an SNL bit prepared, but hello. Very happy, very excited to be doing this. This is exciting.
That's a weird opening monologue to give.
Yeah, I know.
Brian, I'm just like walking out there. I have nothing prepared. How are you all doing here?
Hey, better than some
Rockefeller City?
monologues I've seen on SNL. Okay.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. But welcome everybody to the start of a new season. We've been planning this one for a bit, Brian. I told you that I wanted to do this one, especially I wanted to do a comedy-focused season because I've talked a lot about my start in podcasting was horror, but in terms of just my love of film, it really starts with comedy. I think a fair amount of like the comedies that star SNL people were movies that I shared a lot with my dad in particular. There's a lot in terms of like my thoughts on comedy I would like to get out, and I figured that the SNL thing would be appropriate given SNL is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. We're recording this not too long after they did like all the big like specials and stuff in like late February. Even though it is a bit of cheating because SNL didn't have its 50th anniversary officially until October. But I guess they wanted to still have it within the 50th season or whatever. So they decided to have it then. But it still counts for us. And plus, the timing worked out because we'll just say the season proper will be starting on April Fool's Day.
Yeah, funniest day. Not the funniest show necessarily, but an institution. We will talk about SNL.
That's true. We should probably get that out of the way right now in terms of like our sort of relationship with the show. Which is to say, I think it's appropriate that you didn't have a bit, Brian, because you've told me that you're not as up on like SNL itself as a show.
No, yeah, it's really interesting. You kind of saying that your kind of like love of comedy and was tied to your love of cinema early on, and I did not have that at all. I am very much, as I am with like a few different genres that we do, like horror or stuff like that. I am not as well versed. When I got into movies, it was more into sort of like independent cinema and world cinema. It was not really comedy. It was not ever really my thing. I did not grow up with a family that watched SNL. We're not American, so it was never really a big thing in my house. There were some like of the SNL star vehicles that I would watch every now and then, but I always kind of, I don't know, not like turn my nose up, but I was always kind of like, oh, that's trash. That's like, whatever. It's not like it wasn't real cinema or whatever. I don't know, just didn't feel like it was appealing to me necessarily. The kind of crude, crass kind of comedy that a lot of the SNL vehicle movies that we're talking about kind of have. But I cannot deny, the kind of like institution that is SNL, and as we've been discussing and as I've been kind of looking into a lot of the movies that we're talking about and alternatives, all that stuff, I think like it just kind of goes to show like not just how big SNL is, but like a certain type of comedy and a certain type of comedy movie that we both grew up with is so indebted to SNL, and just the amount of stars, like comedy stars and just people who made these movies, directors and stuff like that, it's kind of crazy, I think, to just kind of think that it goes back to SNL, and that a lot of them got the start on SNL and stuff like that, and just the mammoth of an institution that SNL is, and how like influential it is, even though like, I and many people have been very critical of the show in recent years, but like, it's fascinating to dive into just the importance of it, as how it leads to so many movie stars and these beloved films as we go along and stuff. I don't have too much of a history with it. I'm kind of trying to dive in, of course, with some of the kind of older movies that we're doing. Some of the I have asked Thomas. He very very graciously made me a playlist, basically kind of curated with our season this season. So yeah, I'm trying to kind of get a bit more context so that I understand some of this, but it also just feels kind of like so kind of like beyond me in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, I might put that playlist in the show notes for people. It's basically just like a collection of sketches that roughly at least kind of sum up the stars of our different vehicles that we'll be talking about. But yeah, I guess I had the different thing where, like, because my dad was literally, I'll probably talk about this a bit more when we get to our first episode, but my dad was like literally at the exact right age to like watch SNL when it started. Like the first Not Ready for Primetime Players cast was his cast. And so he really mythologized SNL for me a lot. And also, if you like comedy at all, if you're a comedy nerd to any degree, you get that kind of thing of like, oh, SNL, all the hallowed people who came from here, like Chevy Chase and John Belushi and Bill Murray, and then even going down the line and stuff. And I definitely had that kind of like worship of it. I remember very distinctly watching a lot of the old SNLs either on Comedy Central, they would rerun old episodes, or on Netflix when I first got the initial streaming version of Netflix. They had the entire run of episodes that just sans music performances pretty much. From like, the very start all the way to probably about like the mid-2000s. And then the mid-2000s were around when I got into it in terms of like the Andy Samberg, like Lonely Island shorts and shit. Were like so culturally omnipresent to like a teenager in the mid-2000s. I still remember very distinctly like looking on YouTube desperately for Lazy Sunday and just finding 500 recreations and not like the actual version. That's how far along this. Back in my day, you couldn't have Lazy Sunday on your YouTubes.
I do want to say, like, I grew up with the sort of like Will Ferrell, Kristen Wiig, like that kind of era of SNL, and even as someone who, growing up, like I didn't really know what SNL was even. I just knew that, like, oh, Anchorman and like,
Right.
Step Brothers, like these kind of movies. So it kind of just, it does show just how like pervasive in the culture SNL was. Even if I didn't know what it was, I was still kind of like being touched by SNL because of like the different movies, and like, there were so many like kids at my middle school loved Anchorman and loved like Step Brothers and stuff like that. So yeah, it's interesting how much it kind of reaches, even if you're not like tuned in necessarily.
No, yeah, but I think what's interesting also is that like I'll say this much, that like that kind of mythologizing of SNL have definitely dwindled on in recent years. Not in the way of like every single fucking person who has watched SNL is like, oh man, it's not nearly as good as insert time when I was a teenager and I first got into it, which is always the thing. Any of those YouTube videos, Brian, if you scroll down the comments, all the comments are that pretty much. Just like, oh man, this is back when SNL was SNL, and it's like I don't know. I think SNL has gone through plenty of great and rough periods overall. But yeah, it feels definitely like in recent years they maybe lost their teeth. And I blame that not entirely, but mainly on Colin Jost. I fucking hate Colin Jost so much. Sorry, Scarlett, if you're listening. I'm so sorry to talk about your man like that. But yeah, I don't know. I think that whole institution has got like that kind of like hollowed ground angle of it has really dissipated for me. Even though there are very talented people on SNL right now, like Bowen Yang and Sarah Sherman. There are talented people that still work at SNL. The whole problem with SNL is that, like, when it started, as we learned from Jason Reitman's great film from last year, Saturday Night, it was initially very counterculture and, like, scrappy. But not too long into its run, it became, like, a massive pop culture thing. And then as it kept going, and particularly after, like, the period where Lorne Michaels left, then he came back, then he had a really bad, like, 11th season, where Robert Downey Jr. and Anthony Michael Hall were cast members. But then after that point, it really just kind of became like, oh, this is Lorne's empire. Like, when you get to that point, it's no longer like this counterculture thing. It's just like an institution, like you're mentioning,
Right.
and they hire interesting people that go on to do other great things. But yeah, I don't have the same love and reverence for, say, like Lorne, as much as I do have interest in hearing people do Lorne impressions. That's always funny to me.
Yeah.
Maybe if
I
you've ever heard Doctor Evil, that's basically a Lorne impression.
I think yeah, that's where it kind of came from when I was like growing up was and figuring out like oh, like all of the comedy movie stars that I grew up with, people like Ben Stiller, Mike Myers, like Adam Sandler, Tina Fey, like just kind of knowing like oh, all of them come from not from SNL, right? But like that's where they kind of like got their platform a lot of the time. That's where they kind of got famous and stuff like that. Like I think that fact in itself is kind of like where I'm coming from in this kind of like again from a distance like SNL. Like I've thought many times like what if I just watch every episode of SNL? Like what if I take that project on? And it's I think my brain would melt because of just the sort of the weird time capsule stuff, but also just like as you and a few other people have like mentioned like the show's not always great. Like it has its kind of like off weeks, you know, and just kind of isn't always amazing.
Or even the best episodes of SNL still have like plenty of like shit that's filler and isn't really that funny, or is like
Right.
so outdated that you're just like, what the fuck even is this? What are they talking about? Because
Exactly.
I tried exactly what you're talking about in high school with like the Netflix thing. I was like, I'm gonna watch all the not ready for primetime players thing, and I think I did that for the first season, and then pretty much I just went from like season 2 and 3 like onward. I watched like a handful of episodes from each season. Because that would just
Yeah.
be like fucking maddening to do all of them. Just ones that I had interest in, based on the hosts and stuff like that. But yeah, let's go ahead and announce our lineup though, Brian, because we've been talking a lot about SNL in general. So we will now be announcing what our lineup's going to be. We're going to start off first our C for Classic, which will come out once again on April 1st, April Fool's Day. It will be a full episode. It won't be a joke. It will be an actual episode of the show. Will be The Blues Brothers from 1980, which is kind of breaking our usual rule for C for Classic. Usually we like to do 1979 and backward as C for Classic, but we figured like we'll get into it I think in the Blues Brothers episode, but there's not a lot in the actual like 70s era that we want to like devote a whole episode to necessarily. And having seen Blues Brothers, I think you can agree that that feels so distinctly late 70s more than it ever does like an 80s movie.
Yeah. From what you have told me, this is kind of the best case scenario for kind of like the classic era of SNL, you know, and even still, you know, we'll have to talk about John Landis and stuff like that, but yeah, I think it seems like it kind of represents I think this kind of era of SNL quite well in a way that I don't know, maybe some other options we had would be a bit tougher, it seems.
Yeah, but then our Eye for Indie, we're going forward quite a bit. On April 8th, we'll have our Eye for Indie episode that's about Brigsby Bear from 2017, starring Kyle Mooney. It's a movie that I think is very underrated, and I would love to talk about. And you have not seen this one.
No, I remember when it came out and it kind of hearing that like oh Mark Hamill was in it and that was kind of a big
Yes.
deal. But yeah, I'm kind of excited. I from what little I've seen of Kyle Mooney, I think he is pretty funny. So yeah, I'm excited for that one.
Then our N for New, which will come out on April 15th, just in time for Tax Day, everyone's favorite funny holiday. We'll be talking about Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar, of course, starring and co-written by Kristen Wiig, which you have seen, Brian.
I mean, a phenomenal movie. Yeah, I've seen it twice now. I cannot wait to see it again. I think this movie is hilarious, and we'll talk obviously about I think the current state of like SNL comedies and comedy vehicles is kind of lacking, I would say, and this is kind of a perfect case scenario of like this is what we kind of miss from the SNL vehicle, and it's just a fucking hilarious movie. So yeah,
Or just, I don't know, comedy movies in general, regardless of
That's true,
SNL or
yeah.
not, really. Then our E for Egregious, which we should shout out, our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter voted for this one. Our E for Egregious on April 22nd will be Bewitched from 2005, starring Will Ferrell, of course. And yeah, I have seen this one. I think it fits for Egregious. because we could have gone with a lot of different, very terrible comedies for
Sure.
this.
Yeah.
But I think Bewitched is a more interesting failure to talk about.
Yeah, I feel like there are other movies we could have picked that are worse, and that haven't like aged well, obviously, and just stuff like that. But this, I have not seen, but seems to be an interesting sort of failure in terms of an SNL vehicle. And we'll talk about Will Ferrell, of course, who I have kind of a conflicted history with, so that'll be really exciting to talk about as well.
Then our M for Masterpiece on April 29th, we'll be covering Billy Madison from 1995, starring, of course, Adam Sandler and a couple other SNL veterans of that era. And we were very adamant about getting a Adam Sandler one on here. We both have a respect for, yes, the Sandman. And we wanted to cover one, and we figured that this one would be at least like a very representative, particularly like the early Sandler era.
An interesting thing I think about this series will be just kind of talking about our history with the individual stars of these movies. You know, like
Yes.
I think Sandler especially. I think it'll be really interesting to talk about my history of growing up and like going along with the grain of everyone else, being like, yeah, he sucks, his movies are terrible, and now as an adult, I think he's amazing and one of the funniest people on this planet, and I love Billy Madison. So yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, we're not too far off on that. There's a lot to discuss with that. But
Yeah.
but then we'll be wrapping up our season with our A for Atypical Best in Show on May 6th, of course, from Christopher Guest, who had initially like an SNL period, but is very odd in terms of like his run is very short. We'll talk about it on the episode. But this movie also has a lot of different big comedic character actors in it who come from other parts of the comedy world that aren't SNL related. And it's also just very funny. And I'm curious, because you have not seen this one either.
No, and this is probably the one I know the least about, I would say. And although I know like a lot of the cast members, I don't know much about their time on SNL. I think I would say like probably the least of like a lot of the different eras that we're covering here. So yeah, I'm really excited, and I mean, just again looking at that cast, it's amazing. So yeah, it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, so I'll just run them down real quick one more time here. On April 1st, our C for Classic on the Blues Brothers. On April 8th, our I for Indie on Brigsby Bear. On April 15th, our N for New for Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar. On April 22nd, our E for Egregious episode on Bewitched. On April 29th, our M for Masterpiece episode for Billy Madison. And then on May 6th, our A for Atypical choice, Best in Show. While we're going to be doing that on the main feed, Brian, we should shout out that the Patreon's going to be booming over there. Patreon.com/cinema #2letter for just $1 a month or $3 for an individual audio bit, which is the lowest price I can give, by the way, out there. This is all Patreon fee problems, everybody. But for either of those options, you get a lot of different stuff that we'll be covering, including some reviews for movies that were recently released in theaters. I know we, as of recording, we would have recently put out our one for Paddington, Peru, and then also one for Mickey 17. That would be our March one, which we're both very excited about. And there'll also be a couple episodes of Marco Polo, which is the monthly Adult Swim podcast I do with Tori DePina, friend of the show. But then also we'll have our March Madness for Best Action Sequences, would have come out hopefully around this time, which we're very excited about. And then in April, our big bonus podcast is going to be our Final Destination full franchise. So we'll be covering all 5 of those films that would have been released as of April in prep for Final Destination Bloodlines coming out in May. Which, I'm very curious because you have not seen any of those.
No, I've seen bits and pieces, but just never a horror franchise I've never really gotten into. But I grew up kind of around that franchise, so it'll be interesting to like actually watch the movies. But yeah, and also I saw the trailer for that new one, and it looks pretty cool. Actually, I'm kind of interested in it.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap up here, Brian. We want to thank some people. We want to thank Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 over on Twitter. And thanks to our patrons, of course, our Cineast patrons, patreon.com/cinema #2letter, where you can get all that great stuff that we talked about earlier. And of course, You can find us at Cinema to the Letter on whatever hell site you happen to be perusing, and I am on Blue Sky and Letterboxd as at Not the Who's Tommy, and also I do some writing occasionally at film-cred.com.
Yes, and you can also follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky if you would like at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or if more consistently you want to know what I'm watching for some reason, you can also follow me on Letterboxd, just at my name. But yeah, follow me on either of those.
Yes, and on that note, we should also say if you want to follow us on in audio form, you can subscribe to us over on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, our great podcast network, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on the network? And you can also dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for the past 8 seasons of this show and all the old Double Edge Double Bill stuff, all there for you to peruse. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight. But the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. So stay tuned for next week, in which we'll be releasing from behind the paywall our March Madness bracket from last year, in which Brian, Lily Labens, Krishan Baker, John Patterson, and myself went through and determined the best movie monster of all time, which is in conjunction with our March Madness for this year, which is for Best Action Sequence. That'll be coming out around the same time next week. So once again, the March Madness from last year about the movie monsters will be coming out over on the main feed to kind of help promote the Action Sequences one, which will be coming out for behind the Patreon, which will feature Brian, Marcelo Pico, Siobhan Irving, Shaquille Lambert, and myself. A big Talk Film Society fest. This is where they'll all be available on the Patreon, which you can buy the individual audio for the $3, or you can become a patron at Cineast for just $1 a month, and you'll be able to listen to that Action Sequences one. But if you, want some March Madness, we'll still have the one from last year about movie monsters on the main feed. Stay tuned for that, and then our SNL season will follow as we announced here for the schedule. And let's say our good nights, everybody. Good night, everybody. Oh, now we're hugging on the stage, and the credits are going by real fast, and you hear the saxophone like.